Hey everybody, what's up and welcome back to Pixorama. I'm Jimzip. For those of you who don't speak French, that's Jimzip. And today we're going to delve into something a little more technical. Sounds like a bunch of tosh.
No, it's super important actually.
She's absolutely right. Today we're going to be focusing a bit on lighting.
Baby, just a little finger, sticky. You my electrical lip on flavor. I got to do your top.
Lighting is important for any kind of art. Pixel art's no exception. And having a good idea in your head about how lighting works is a really, really valuable tool to have. So dive on in with me. I hope you guys enjoyed the video and I hope it's helpful.
With the and the fucking with the things and the summer with the fire and the
Right, so the asset I've chosen to demonstrate a lot of this lighting business is a simple stone column. And I've done this for a few reasons. First of all, because it's got nice clear surfaces that we can see, and also because it's got some texture on it, those cracks there, which might come in handy for some of the techniques we're going to look at. And finally, because it doesn't have too much detail, and it also uses quite a simple color palette.
But I wanted something really complex.
Well, that was dumb.
Yes, well, later on I will get into a more complex object and show some of these same techniques again. But for now, let's get into it. So the first example I'm going to get into is lighting from the front. Now this asset was designed for the light to come from above. As you can see, the top is the lightest part of the object. So we're going to take that color and we're going to use it, we're going to reassign it. We're going to put it on the front of the object now because our light is obviously coming from the front. Now the exact height of your light source will of course make a difference, but we're not going to get too bogged down in technicalities. We're going to assume that this light's coming straight on from the front, which means that the sides of this object and the top as well are going to become darker. But how do we know this? And how do we know how the light's going to play with any given object?
I'm guessing the solution to this is ridiculous.
Not so much. Obviously one of the best ways to learn about lighting is just to look at stuff. Even the simplest objects lying around can be helpful. Chuck them under a light and check out how it plays off different materials. Specular highlights can look very different on plastic or metal, on glass or on stone. Move your light source around and check out how the shadows shift too. Do they shrink or sharpen, or do they blur? Do they fade away or get darker? All this stuff's super helpful as a reference. Knowing all this, we can now apply it to our object. And soon enough, we've got a light source coming from the front instead of above. Okay, let's move on to light source on the side. We're going to take the same principles and apply them as if the light were coming from the right-hand side of the object. So using that light color from the top again, we're just going to shift it around until it's coming from the right. I'm going to fix up a couple of shadows and a couple of highlights on the edges of those blocks. And when I flick back and forth here, you can see the difference between the two lighting sources now. Front and side, front and side. And as I mentioned before, this is quite a simple object, so for changing light sources from the front to the side or from the top to the side or what have you, it's relatively simple. But let's get into something a wee bit more dramatic. What if we wanted, for example, the light source to come from behind the object? This is a really cool effect and it can be used to add a lot of drama to scenes and sprites. And to change the light source in this way, it may be a little more time consuming, but it's really not that much more difficult. Although there are a couple of little tricks we can employ to make this look really neat. One thing I will do straight away is pick an even darker color than what we already have in this object's palette. And that might not always be an option. Oftentimes we do have to work with restriction.
Why are you so restricted?
I only have a palette of 4 colors to work with, and you are gripping me.
Use a wider palette from now on.
I will use Pico 8, I swear.
Anyway, I have no such restriction here. But the reason I'm choosing these new colors is because I really want to increase the contrast of this object. And even if you are confined to a pretty restrictive palette, you can still use the techniques here to get the desired effect. And one of the techniques for getting a really cool popping backlight is to highlight the outline of the object. Our light source is coming from directly behind the object, so closest to us there's not going to be much light. But on the back we're going to see that little halo. We're going to see those edges really gleaming in that light. And as you can see, I've chosen an even brighter shade of blue, an even more vibrant shade of blue, just to really intensify that light source behind. Now you can do this in a solid outline, or you can do this in dots and dashes, and little bits and pieces like I've done here. Depends on what you're after, and of course you've got your own taste and style. But let's move on to the next part, and that is shadowing. Now depending on where your light source is, of course your shadows are going to change the way they fall, and they're also going to change their shape. And by that I mean they're either going to be sharp or they're going to be fuzzy. A light source that's really close to the object tends to leave a very fuzzy shadow. The closer the light source is, the fuzzier that shadow is going to get. But the further away that light source, the sharper that shadow is going to get. So let's imagine for this first example that we're using a point light that's relatively close to the object. It's sitting just above and it's shining down at an angle. So this shadow then has to be kind of fuzzy. Now obviously here, as I'm just doing a speedy example, this is not going to be very precise. But that's the general gist of it. Close light, fuzzy shadow. Now what we also have to think about is specularity. Specular highlights are the little glints you get on some objects when the light hits it. And depending on the surface of your object and the type of light, these specular highlights are going to be different. Generally though, there's a rule we can follow for specularity.
I love it when people tell me about rules. I just love it. Tell me.
Yikes, okay. It's that the glossier the object is, the sharper that specular highlight's going to be. For example, glass is going to have a really, really tight specular highlight, whereas something like rubber is going to have a very smooth, very dulled and diffused specular highlight. So as you can see with this ball, we've got two different examples here. And for some reason I also changed the shadow. But what's important is that specular highlight. So let's move on to some shadowing. Shadowing is relatively simple for most objects, especially an object like this. All you got to do is, again, just keep in mind the position of your light source. Higher lights are going to create shorter shadows, and lower lights are going to stretch those shadows out. So if your light source is coming directly from above your object, you're going to have a very short shadow that doesn't really travel very far. Whereas a light low, perhaps on the horizon or what have you, is going to really stretch that shadow out behind the object. And of course there are times when you might not have a shadow at all, when your light source is in a weird or kooky position, perhaps underneath an object. So let's see how all of this applies to an actual sprite. Here we have a little pirate, and he's obviously a bit more complex than that column we were using earlier. He's got some lips and edges and bits that overlap, and all of this is going to affect the way the lighting plays off him. Now I designed this sprite to have the lighting coming from the front in a very even way, so there wasn't much contrast to it. But in this example I want the light to come from directly above, and I want it to be pretty strong. So once again, as I did with the column, I'm going to pick out some colors that are darker than the original palette, and some colors that are lighter than the original palette, to get this enhanced contrast effect. And all of those little overhangs, like for example the hat, are going to cast a shadow. Now let's try a weird light source, a light source from below. And for this, what I'm going to do is invert all the highlights and shadows. I'm going to start by putting highlights on all the undersides of the objects, and shadows on the tops of them all. This feels distinctly weird when you're doing it, and it probably should because lighting from below is generally unnatural and kind of weird. It's employed mostly for spooky, dramatic, or supernatural situations. Ugh, maybe the only thing they did right. Generally, this type of light brings a sense of unease to the viewer, but it isn't always so, and it can look pretty cool. Imagine if this character was standing on a glimmering pile of gold, for example. Alright, let's try lighting this guy from behind. This will require a bit of playing around to get looking good, but the concept is the same from what we did before. Basically, we're going to make all the surfaces closest to us quite dark, and we're going to give the object a kind of lip of light around the edges, because your character will probably be seen on a pretty dark background. And if your character's also dark, your viewer's going to have a hard time finding it. So you can see I've also given a subtle gradation to the beard here, and made the closest part really extra dark, and then slowly given way to the lighter edge. Just getting rid of some of those bright dots, and that's pretty much it for this light source. Now another thing we can of course do is play with the color of the light source itself. These light sources don't always have to be white. In this example, perhaps I want a pink light source, perhaps there's gemstones behind this character casting a little glow onto him or what have you. And we can do this by tinting all these highlights, ringing the object. And in this case, I'm going to tweak them to give them all a pink and purple, sort of a varying hue between those two colors. And playing with the colors of these light sources can create some really cool results. But there are shortcuts we can also take to speed up our work. For example, if I want to see how this character looks with a bluish hued light shining on him, I can just create another layer, select a blue I like, and turn it to multiply, and immediately we can see how this object would look if we went through the process of actually changing all the highlights manually. Now from here I could just expand on this whole concept, and if I wanted to I could start designing a level around this, perhaps even drawing in that light source so it's easier to keep in mind where it is. And often in these scenes where there's very low light, you can get away with using very, very few colors. For example, if I just pick a highlight color here and a slightly weaker background color, I can give the impression that there are objects in this scene, even though I'm really only hinting at them. I'm just giving them highlights and I'm giving them a little bit of fill. And doing this, you can set a really cool mood for whatever scene you're designing. So, using all these techniques, we can come up with some really cool little lighting effects here. which are guaranteed to bring some drama or some visual interest to whichever scene or character you throw them at. So that's it for another episode of Pixorama. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and as usual, drop a comment below if you want to see something in future episodes. Give me a like and subscribe to see more videos like this.
Marvelous things await you, and it's free.
Have a good morning, noon, or night wherever you are. Ciao!
Pixorama.